What if the very treaty that once bound two continents together now trembles at the clang of a tariff bell, echoing through marble hallways and steel-filled factories? The shockwave of a 25% duty on American goods reverberates across the Atlantic, rattling desks, stirring the scent of ozone from high-voltage wires, and unsettling the calm of diplomatic lounges. For decades the United States and the European Union stood as twin pillars of the Transatlantic alliance, their defense pacts, NATO drills, and trade accords forming the backbone of the Western world. Yet recent disputes over tariffs have cracked this seemingly solid foundation, exposing a fragile core that now whispers of possible rupture. How far can a single economic strike push a partnership built on shared values before it collapses into mistrust? The coming retaliation will decide whether the alliance can mend or will fracture beyond repair. Facing the roar of retaliatory measures, Brussels erected a towering tax wall against American products, targeting everything from steel and aluminum to cars, farm harvests, and even motorcycles. The United States, defending its stance with a mantra of national security, warned that unchecked European competition threatens domestic jobs, while European leaders decried the move as political manipulation and economic bullying. The claim of a long-standing trade deficit fuels the fire, and non-tariff barriers are painted as unfair hurdles. With each proclamation, the air in conference rooms grew thick with tension, the rust of old steel mingling with the acrid smell of heated debate. Could the looming trade war be more about political posturing than pure economics? Will the shared defense mechanisms of NATO survive the escalating fiscal duel, or will mistrust seep into military cooperation, dimming the once bright beacon of unity? The next move on this high-stakes chessboard could either force a compromise or ignite a cascade of further sanctions, leaving the future of the Western alliance hanging in a precarious balance. Is a century-old partnership on the brink of collapse because of a 25% tax on every American-made car that rolls into a European garage? Imagine the clang of steel factories quieting, the smell of fresh-cut timber in warehouses turning sour, and diplomats exchanging thinly veiled threats across marble tables. The scene feels more like a battlefield than a boardroom. Earlier we saw the United States label European measures as political manipulation and economic bullying, while Washington insisted it had long run a trade deficit with the continent and that EU regulations choked American firms. Frustrated, the European Commission announced a mirror-image set of duties, targeting everything from farm produce to motorcycles and iconic steel brands. Now the EU has turned its tariff sword on U.S. goods, a move that stunned Washington. Headlines shouted that America was shocked by Europe's retaliation after Trump's tariff crusade. Few expected Europe to strike back so forcefully. The clash is no longer a simple U.S. China spat, it pits the two original architects of global trade against each other, each now erecting walls where once they built bridges. What drives this escalation? Is it pure economics or a calculated political gamble? Populist leaders portray protectionism as a shield for domestic jobs, yet the reality spirals into a lose-lose vortex. U.S. manufacturers watch export hopes evaporate as Europe slaps counter tariffs. At the same time, European exporters feel the sting of restricted access to the American market. The specter of a fragmented Western alliance haunts the discussion. NATO still binds the militaries, and joint diplomatic efforts persist, but trade wars gnaw at mutual trust. If political tensions intensify, even defense cooperation could falter. European journalists ask why a longtime ally behaves like a rival, while American pundits chant that Europe has been exploiting the United States for too long. The transatlantic bond, once forged in shared values, now trembles under domestic political pressure. Both sides claim fairness. The EU's retaliation spans high duties on American agricultural output, motorcycles, celebrated brands, and steel, products chosen to hit political strongholds in U.S. states reliant on heavy industry. The logic is clear: answer their tariffs with pressure on the very sectors that fuel their own electoral base. American officials invoke national security justifications, arguing that outsourcing steel and aluminum weakens defense capabilities. Europe counters that such claims misuse security rhetoric to mask trade protection, violating World Trade Organization rules. The WTO, however, remains powerless as the United States brushes aside its rulings and Europe struggles to find an effective remedy. What lies ahead for the transatlantic partnership? If the tariff tit-for-tat continues, Europe might pursue an independent defense and economic strategy, eroding U.S. global leadership. A shift toward strategic autonomy is already brewing in Brussels, and the possibility of a realigned NATO looms. Should Europe drift away, powers like Russia and China could exploit the division, expanding their influence while the West wars itself from within. Will the mutual acrimony subside into a compromise, or will this trade war deepen, pulling the alliance apart piece by piece? The answer hangs in the balance, waiting for the next diplomatic volley. A storm of tariffs has erupted, and the world watches the sparks fly. Why would two longtime partners, bound by a shared defense pact and a century of trade, suddenly hurl economic weapons at each other? Can a single policy decision unleash a chain reaction that rattles markets, rattles factories, and rattles the very idea of a united Western Front? The answer may lie in the quiet corridors of Brussels, where officials have just unveiled a sweeping new tax wall. They target everything from American corn and soybeans to the sleek motorcycles that roar across U.S. highways, an audacious move meant to strike at the heart of Washington's political support base. The question now hangs in the air, heavy as exhaust fumes: will Europe's bold counterattack force a renegotiation of terms, or will it plunge the alliance into a deeper abyss? In the previous segment we saw Europe's retaliation, sweeping duties on U.S. farm goods, motorcycles, iconic brands, and steel, chosen to hit key manufacturing states and apply pressure on American domestic politics. The EU hopes to coax Washington into concessions, while some Americans argue those measures should be aimed at China instead of an old ally. Today the drama intensifies. The logic behind the EU's tariff list is stark: respond to Washington's charges on European industries while simultaneously squeezing the political engine in U.S. heartland states. By targeting sectors that fuel local economies, corn, wheat, dairy, motorcycles, and steel, the Union hopes to extract a bargain from the White House. Yet a sizable slice of the American public bristles, questioning why resources are spent on a friend when the real adversary should be China. Economists aligned with former leaders argue that America has long suffered from unfair European competition. They claim the pressure will eventually push the EU back to the negotiating table, offering more favorable terms. So far, compromise remains elusive. The automotive arena has become a powder keg. German and French manufacturers, pillars of Europe's export strength, are stunned by the prospect of extra U.S. duties on their cars. These giants already operate massive factories on American soil, and a new tariff could cripple profit margins on both sides. The political climate is so heated that no rational voice can simply say, "Let's back down." Steel and aluminum have followed a similar path. Reciprocal duties have driven up prices, inflated production costs, and strained household budgets. The European Commission warns that unchecked protectionism could topple the global trading system, a warning echoed in boardrooms across continents. Across the Atlantic, Washington counters that without protective measures, domestic industries would wither. This stance, however, erodes the shared values and economic unity that have long underpinned the Western alliance. At NATO summits, leaders still stand together on defense, the Russian threat, and Middle Eastern stability. Yet on trade, former friends now assume rival stances, and the alliance's political spirit trembles. If farmers, manufacturers, and consumers continue to bear the brunt of escalating duties, the question looms larger: are we on the brink of a full-scale economic rupture with a partner we once called an ally? The answer may emerge in the next round of negotiations, where each side weighs the cost of pride against the price of division. In a world where allies are becoming adversaries, the fabric of the Western alliance is fraying. Trust, once a cornerstone of relations between the United States and Europe, is now overshadowed by tariffs and political posturing. Leaders from both sides, previously united against external threats, now stand at a crossroads where every economic decision feels like a battle cry. As farmers, industrialists, and everyday consumers clash under the weight of mounting tariffs, the core of their partnership teeters on the brink of collapse. Imagine waking up to the echoing sounds of industry halted by trade barriers. Steel and automotive giants in Europe suffer, resonating with a collective sigh of frustration. American officials tout national security as their defense for imposing tariffs, labeling Europe a potential threat. Yet, how can insidious whispers of suspicion arise against allies? Isn't that a deep insult? Yet, Washington insists on protecting its strategic resources, pushing Europe to question the very foundation of their partnership. The clash is not merely economic, it's a war of ideologies. The European Union argues that shielding trade behind the guise of national security is a violation of international norms. When did the quest for unity transform into a legislative battlefield? The World Trade Organization seems powerless to intervene, while the U.S. sidesteps its rulings with careless ease. So, where does this leave the future of the Western alliance? As tensions escalate, the prospect of the European Union developing its independent strategies looms larger. This shift could fundamentally challenge American dominance on the global stage. Picture a Europe that stands tall, forging its own defense policies, unencumbered by its erstwhile ally. Is this the dawn of a new era, where economics dictate allegiances? In this high-stakes game of chess, strategic autonomy is increasingly appealing to European leaders. But can they truly detach from U.S. military might? The atmosphere is thick with uncertainty, and the question remains, what if this growing divide becomes the catalyst for a fractured globe, leading nations like Russia and China to gain the upper hand? How will the world react if a weakened alliance crumbles under the weight of its own divisions? The tension is palpable, and the answer may reshape geopolitics forever. A bold question echoes across the Atlantic. What if the once unbreakable bond between America and Europe shatters, letting rivals like Russia and China stride forward while the West crumbles from inside? The scent of rusted steel and the distant hum of factory whistles drift into memory, recalling a summer in a German plant where workers sweated beneath humming machines, their hands raw from loading car parts. Back then, the idea of a trade war seemed distant, a whisper among diplomats. Now, tariffs roar like artillery, slicing through decades of cooperation. Could this be the moment the alliance finally collapses? Summary of the previous scene. The flashback showed how close ties once felt, but today those ties are fraying under punitive duties. The United States has slapped steep levies on European steel, aluminum, cars, and farm goods, citing national security. Europe answered with equally harsh taxes on American wheat, motorcycles, and luxury brands, targeting states that voted for the tariffs. German and French manufacturers now stare at plummeting sales, their CEOs whispering about abandoning the partnership. Russian strategists celebrate, hoping the NATO fabric tears wider, while Beijing watches, ready to fill any power vacuum. Domestic politics on both sides push protectionist reflexes, promising jobs while eroding mutual trust. Defenders of the Transatlantic Pact remind us that shared values once outweighed profit margins, yet those ideals are now buried beneath piles of duty notices. The European Commission's bold move shocked Washington, sparking accusations of unilateral aggression. As each side threatens pay the price, the future hangs in balance. Will a compromise emerge, or will the trade war deepen, forever reshaping global power? A startling question lingers: can the once unbreakable transatlantic partnership survive a full-scale trade war? For decades the United States and the European Union stood as pillars of NATO, shared defense pacts, and seamless commerce. Yet recent tariff battles have cracked this foundation, turning allies into rivals overnight. Previously we traced the rise of protectionism. Washington announced a sweeping 25% levy on a wide array of American imports, from steel and aluminum to cars and farm produce. The claim: rescue a chronic trade deficit and shield national security. Brussels answered with a retaliatory wall of duties targeting the same categories, aiming the blows at politically sensitive industries in key American states. The air in Brussels tasted of heated rhetoric, while streets in Washington echoed with angry chants about unfair competition. In the wake of those moves, both sides warned of a looming collapse of the Western alliance. Traditional cooperation on defense and diplomacy remains, but trust erodes as each tariff raises prices, inflates production costs, and squeezes consumers. German auto giants, already operating factories on American soil, now face the threat of punitive taxes that could devastate sales. Steel and aluminum tariffs have already sent shockwaves through supply chains, leaving factories humming with uncertainty. The European Union labels the U.S. security rationale a thin disguise for economic bullying, while America insists that strategic stockpiles demand protection. The dispute spills into legal arenas. Yet the World Trade Organization appears powerless as the U.S. ignores its rulings. Looking ahead, the specter of a permanent split looms large. Some analysts fear Europe may carve out an independent defense and trade strategy, eroding U.S. global leadership. Others warn that a fragmented West would hand the reins to rivals such as China and Russia, who could expand their influence amid the chaos. If politicians cling to populist tariffs instead of seeking compromise, the damage could cascade into a worldwide recession. The question now hangs in the balance: will leaders find a path back to mutual trust, or will the trade war spiral into a deeper, irreversible rupture? The next move could decide the fate of an alliance that once seemed indestructible. What if the cornerstone of the Western world is not being battered by missiles, but by tariffs that hiss like steam vents, leave a metallic aftertaste in the air, and reverberate with the relentless clatter of closed factories? Could a simple piece of paper, stamped with duties, unleash a chain reaction louder than any battlefield, shaking the very notion of friend and ally across continents? The stakes feel as high as a freighter yard crane at midnight, its steel bones groaning under unseen pressure. Previously, the fierce tariff clash ignited a debate over the demise of the Western alliance, while reminding us that its political and military foundations remain far from shattered, provided a swift compromise emerges. The fractured foundation of shared values now trembles in the shadow of the US-EU conflict. Nations watch as economic blocs sharpen, their edges glinting like cold steel under a harsh winter sun. To navigate this turbulence, leaders would have to set aside domestic ambitions, yet today's politicians clutch populist banners like lifelines, sealing the door on cooperation. Even though the Western Bloc is not entirely broken, the concepts of friend and ally have been battered by this trade fight. Both the EU and the US still share geopolitical goals, yet the dispute chips away at the trust that once bound them. Experts argue that reason will eventually prevail, guiding the parties back to agreement, but swelling populist waves make that outcome increasingly uncertain. If anxieties continue to rise, the rhetorical question about the alliance's end may turn into a stark reality. Can the clash of economic interests destroy security and political solidarity altogether? Or will a hidden accord emerge from this storm, rescuing the transatlantic bond before it finally snaps under the weight of relentless tariffs?